Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The Obi Mansion was a monument to silence. Stretching over 2 acres of marble, glass, and guarded fences, it stood like a graveyard of emotions, a palace where no one laughed, cried, or dared to breathe too loud. After losing his wife and only daughter in a horrific accident 5 years ago, Dyke Obi had erased every trace of joy from his home. Where once there were birthday balloons and family dinners, now stood glass vases and ticking clocks. His staff moved like ghosts, trained to avoid questions and never speak unless spoken to. Dyke, a 45-year-old billionaire with a firm jawline and stern eyes, walked with a chill that settled in every corner of the house. His empire in oil and logistics had tripled since the loss, but so had his distance from anything human. He fired employees for smiling too often or humming while cleaning. His rule was simple: do your job, leave your soul outside. It was during one of these emotionless mornings that Chidinma was hired. She arrived with a quiet presence, her slim frame wrapped in a plain Maid uniform, her natural hair tied back in a puff. She kept her eyes low and voice lower. She said very little during the interview, just enough to answer questions, but not enough to invite interest. Dyke barely looked at her. She was just another body to maintain his perfect stillness. But what no one knew, not even the head of staff, was that Chidinma was not alone. She had come with a secret hidden in her baggy duffel and the loose folds of her oversized uniform. Adora, a 5-year-old girl with curious eyes and tiny pink beads in her hair, waited in the servant quarters, lying under a thin blanket Chidinma had laid for her on the floor. Chidinma had no family left. Her sister died during childbirth, and the baby was left with her. She couldn't afford a nanny. She couldn't afford to say no to the job. And so, she hid her truth in the corners of the mansion that Dyke no longer cared to see. For the first week, everything was flawless. Chidinma kept the child hidden, cleaning during Adora's nap times and sneaking food into their tiny corner of the servant quarters. At night, she whispered stories to the girl, comforting her with promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Despite her asthma and chronic fatigue, she kept moving. She needed this job. Adora was not her child by blood, but she was her heart. The child brought a flicker of life to Chidinma's otherwise fading world. But inside the mansion, the air remained stiff, heavy with memories of a daughter no one dared speak of. Even Chidinma, though unaware of Dyke's past, felt a strange coldness in the halls, like something beautiful had once lived here and died too soon. Still, she moved quietly, thinking she could survive as long as her secret stayed hidden. But secrets, no matter how carefully buried, always find a way to breathe. By the second week, Chidinma had built a fragile rhythm. Wake before sunrise, feed Adora with bread and pap. She managed to sneak from the kitchen, clean the mansion floor by floor, then retreat quickly before anyone noticed. The girl was well trained. Chidinma had whispered to her every night, "No sound, no movement, no laughter. This is not home. This is our hiding place." And Adora tried, she really did. But she was 5, made of questions and innocence. Sometimes her giggles escaped when Chidinma made a funny face to ease her hunger, or when she played quietly with paper scraps in the corner. And though she understood the rules, she didn't fully understand the danger. She didn't know about the man with cold eyes who once chased a housekeeper away for humming a lullaby. She didn't know that laughter in that house was a threat. Chidinma carried pain, but not the kind that screamed. Hers was a quiet ache, the kind that clutched her lungs during cold nights and made her breath short in the middle of chores. Asthma had followed her since childhood, made worse by stress and poor living. Yet she said nothing. Each day, she scrubbed marble floors that reflected her hollow reflection back at her. Dyke barely noticed her existence. He never asked about her background, never inquired about her health. He only cared that his mansion was spotless and silent, and she made sure it was. But as the days passed, Dyke began to notice something. Her eyes. They held a kind of sadness he couldn't explain. A familiar kind. He didn't speak on it, of course. He pushed it aside like everything else that tried to stir his old wounds. What neither of them realized was that the mansion was already changing. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was breathing again. Adora had drawn a tiny stick figure with chalk on the back wall of the servant quarters. One big figure and one small one, holding hands. She said it was her mummy and me. Chidinma had nearly cried. Every night she tucked the girl in with prayers, telling her that better days would come. She dreamed of saving enough to get a small place of their own. But for now, they had to survive the silence. And so, every giggle was a risk. Every step was a prayer. And every moment of kindness Chidinma gave that child was an act of resistance against the coldness that filled the mansion and the memories Dyke Obi refused to face. It happened on a Thursday. The rain had just begun to fall, soft and persistent against the glass walls of the mansion. Chidinma had been delayed downstairs scrubbing the hallway tiles, her chest already tightening from exhaustion. She had left Adora in the quarters with a storybook and strict instructions. No sound, no singing, no laughing. But Adora, ever innocent, had found an old mirror leaning against the wall. She stood in front of it and began making faces, giggling softly at her own reflection. Her laughter danced through the corridor like music, and for the first time in years, someone laughed inside that mansion. Dyke was upstairs in his study, reviewing numbers. At first, he froze. He thought he imagined it. Then he heard it again, a child's laugh. His pen dropped. He rose slowly, heart pounding in disbelief. That sound, it pierced his soul. A memory flashed. His daughter spinning in the hallway years ago, giggling in the exact same way. That laugh had been gone for 5 years. That laugh had died in a crushed vehicle alongside his wife. And yet, here it was again. He stormed downstairs like a man chasing ghosts. The sound led him to the servant quarters. He kicked open the door and then stopped cold. There she was, a little girl, brown-skinned, small, barefoot, holding a chalk stick, her smile vanishing the moment she saw him. Chidinma rushed in behind him, breathless. But before she could speak, Adora stepped forward and said in the softest, most trembling voice, "Please don't take her away. She's the only mummy I have left." Silence fell like a hammer. Dyke's throat tightened. His hands dropped to his sides. For a moment, the coldness cracked, and something inside him shattered. The child's voice, her innocence, her plea, it mirrored everything he had lost. He looked at her face, at her eyes, and saw his daughter again. But then the pain returned. He stepped back, clenched his jaw, and blinked away the rising tears. "Pack your things," he said, voice like stone. "You're not fired, but you'll leave this house with the child. Be here by morning, but I never want to see her again." Then he turned and walked away, trying not to let the sound of that small, broken cry follow him down the hall. His heart burned, but he reminded himself, no distractions, no feelings, no love, just business. The rain did not stop that night. It poured like judgment as Chidinma packed what little they owned, a faded baby blanket, a cracked plastic water bottle, a few pieces of bread wrapped in nylon, and Adaora's only pair of shoes, worn at the heels. Her fingers trembled as she folded the child's tiny clothes, tears falling silently onto the mattress, where Adora sat curled up, confused and afraid. She didn't know why the nice man with sad eyes had shouted. She didn't understand why home was now somewhere else. Chidinma said nothing. Her breath was already shallow, her chest tight from exhaustion and the strain of the encounter. She reached for her inhaler, used it quickly, and kept moving. She didn't dare protest. She had looked into Dyke Obi's eyes and seen the pain buried there, deep, unmoving, and final. He was not a man who invited sympathy or second chances. So she wrapped her niece in a scarf, hoisted her bag, and stepped into the rain, her spirit soaked even before the first drop hit her face. She had no destination, nowhere to go. Her phone battery was dead. She had no savings, no family to call. The few friends she once trusted were tired of her troubles, and most of them didn't want a child in their small, chaotic lives. Children required care, meals, attention, patience. In the dead of night, soaked and shivering, she tried 2 old addresses before one former colleague reluctantly let her and Adora stay in a tiny parlor. But by morning, that same friend, seeing Adora curled up under a curtain playing with bottle caps, changed her mind. "I'm sorry," the woman said flatly, avoiding eye contact. "I can't keep a child here. My landlord already warned me. It's not personal." And with that, Chidinma was cast out again, still wet, still breathless, but now completely hopeless. She wandered with Adora across streets, searching for a safe space. They ended up under a shed at a mechanic shop. That night, Adora asked if they were poor. Chidinma only held her close and said, "We're just in between blessings." By the third night, she found an old room in a public compound not far from a noisy generator plant. The rent was cheap, too cheap. The air inside was heavy and foul, the floor cracked, and there was no proper window, only a metal sheet with rusted hinges. But it was all she could afford. She paid 2 weeks up front using borrowed money and moved in with Adora. During the day, she resumed her duties at the mansion, quiet and perfect as always. Nobody knew. She left Adora at a nearby woman's shop who agreed, for a small fee, to keep an eye on her till evening. Every morning, she left before sunrise. Every night, she returned late, clutching her chest from the fumes that always filled the air near the generator house. But she had made a promise to Adora, to never leave her, to make life work no matter what. What Chidinma didn't know was that her strength was slowly collapsing, and it was only a matter of time before her body did too. Each morning became a war. Chidinma would wake to the roar of generators, her breath already shortened before her feet hit the dusty floor. Her inhaler was her closest companion, but even it could not silence the coughs that shook her body awake. She would wash Adora's face using water fetched from the compound well, dress her in the neatest clothes she could salvage, and carry her down the narrow alley to the woman's shop. There Adora would sit on a stool, hugging her lunch, 2 slices of bread and water, waiting patiently for her mummy to return. Chidinma would then begin her long walk to the mansion, arriving just in time to clean the marble floors that reminded her of everything she couldn't afford. And yet, through all this, she never complained. Even when she felt like her ribs were collapsing from within, even when her legs trembled from hunger and fatigue, she kept moving, because she had made a vow to give Adora a better life than the one fate had given her. Inside the mansion, nothing had changed. Dyke Obi remained a ghost of a man, well-dressed, punctual, emotionally distant. He didn't ask where Chidinma lived. He didn't want to know. A part of him still thought about the little girl, but every time he did, he drowned the memory in more work, more meetings, more cold logic. He believed he had done the right thing. Children had no place in his world. He was no father. Not anymore. The ache he felt was a price he was willing to pay to protect the walls he had built. And Chidinma, she never once looked at him in anger. She did her job with excellence, always bowed slightly, and disappeared before he could process what he was feeling. But behind her quiet smile were blistered feet, empty pockets, and lungs that barely held up under the pressure. And still she stayed faithful, because Adora deserved to be happy, even if it killed her. Then came the morning she didn't rise. That day, Adora waited at the shop longer than usual. The sun climbed high, and the shadows grew long. The shop owner became worried. She called Chidinma's phone, but there was no answer. Around midday, Adora snuck away from the shop and tried to walk back home, following the crooked alleys until she found their rusted door. She pushed it open and found Chidinma lying on the floor unmoving, her lips slightly parted. Inhaler dropped beside her. The room was thick with fumes from the generator outside. Adora shook her, cried her name, called her mummy over and over again, but she didn't move. Then, trembling, the little girl did the only thing she knew how. She picked up Chidinma's phone and pressed redial. On the other end, Dyke Obi sat in his office, already fuming over her absence. The phone rang. He picked up, and heard a small voice say, "Please, Sir, Mommy is lying down. She can't breathe. Please come." At first, Dyke didn't move. He froze, the phone still pressed to his ear, unable to process what he was hearing. That voice again, the one that haunted his memories. That same delicate tone, filled with innocence and fear, calling him sir like it somehow trusted him. "Where are you?" he asked sharply, standing already, heart pounding. "Do you know the address?" Adora sniffled and repeated the street name Chidinma had made her memorize for emergencies. Dyke grabbed his keys without thinking, stormed out of the mansion, and ordered his driver to step aside. He would drive himself. The memory of that emergency room, his wife's pale face, his daughter's tiny hand going cold, flashed through his mind. He gripped the wheel like a man possessed, racing through traffic, ignoring honking cars and red lights. This wasn't about logic. It wasn't about control. It was about a voice that had pierced his darkness and now might disappear forever if he didn't reach her in time. The address led him to a forgotten compound with cracked walls and broken windows. He parked recklessly and ran toward the crowd gathered by the door. A woman pointed him inside. He burst into the room, and there she was, Chidinma, limp on the floor, her chest barely moving, her skin pale. Adora knelt beside her, still clutching her hand, eyes red from crying. Dyke didn't pause. He scooped Chidinma into his arms, shouted at the bystanders to get out of the way, and raced back to his car with Adora trailing close behind. He didn't speak during the drive. He only drove faster, his eyes flickering to the mirror to watch if Chidinma was still breathing. At the hospital, he shouted for help, demanded oxygen, didn't care about rules or payments. As the doctors wheeled her in, he stood there frozen, in the exact same spot he once stood waiting to hear if his family would survive. The past collided with the present. His hands trembled. His eyes stung. This time, however, they saved her. It took hours. He never left the hallway. Adora fell asleep in his lap. He stayed upright, shoulders square, like a man ready to fight death itself. When the doctor finally came out with a nod, Dyke let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't speak. He only looked up at the ceiling, closed his eyes, and silently thanked God. That night, for the first time in years, he cried, not out of loss, but out of relief. He held Adora close and whispered, "I've got you now." Something broke in him. Something healed. And as dawn broke across the hospital's rooftop, Dyke Obi made a decision. He would never send them away again. Dyke sat in the corner of the hospital waiting room long after the doctors assured him that Chidinma was out of danger. His suit was rumpled, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from executives, board members, even his personal assistant, but he ignored them all. For the first time in years, the world he had built around efficiency and routine felt distant, unimportant, irrelevant. Instead, he watched Adora, who sat beside him now, curled up and sleeping with her tiny head against his arm. She was so small, yet her presence had shattered every wall inside him. He thought back to the moment her voice came through the phone, fragile and terrified. How had he gone from firing maids for minor noise to racing through Lego streets like a madman just to reach a child who wasn't even his? It disturbed him. It humbled him. It haunted him. Somewhere inside, he knew he had done something terribly wrong. He had sent them away, knowing the girl reminded him of the daughter he lost. But in trying to escape pain, he had nearly allowed tragedy to repeat itself. Chidinma was moved into a private recovery room. Dyke had pulled every string necessary to ensure she had the best care, no matter the cost. The hospital staff were confused. This was Dyke Obi, the notoriously cold CEO, pacing outside a maid's door like a worried husband. When he finally stepped inside, he was met with a fragile version of her he hadn't seen before. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips pale, but she was awake, and she tried to sit up the moment she saw him. "Please forgive me," she whispered weakly, thinking he was there to scold her. But Dyke stopped her, moved to her bedside, and shook his head slowly. "No. It is I who should ask for forgiveness." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he meant them. He told her how Adora had called, how he had found her unconscious, how the memory nearly broke him. She listened with tears forming in her eyes. He didn't speak like a boss, not like a CEO, but like a man who had finally been cracked open by truth. That same evening, the doctors recommended a few more days of rest, but Dyke insisted on moving her. "You'll stay in the mansion. Both of you, he said gently, firmly. That place you were living, it's not safe. Not for you. Not for her. Chidinma hesitated. The offer sounded too good, too sudden. Fear and humility warred inside her. But sir, what if I remind you again? She asked softly, eyes lowered. Dyke took a breath, eyes heavy with sorrow. You already do. Every day. But I don't want to run from that anymore. And with that, he arranged for a nurse to accompany them back. That night, for the first time, Adora slept in a real bed with clean sheets and a teddy bear, while Chidinma lay in the guest wing of the mansion, still breathing heavily, but alive. Dyke didn't sleep much, but he smiled to himself as he watched the security cameras, watching over them both as if his soul had finally found something worth protecting again. The mansion felt different now, as though a breeze had blown through it and cleared the cobwebs of grief that had once made it unbearable. For years, Dyke had walked its halls in a shadow, surrounded by marble and silence, his mind always echoing with the absence of footsteps that used to run toward him. But now laughter gently returned, not loud, not intrusive, just soft enough to stir forgotten corners of his heart. Adora drew pictures on scrap paper and left them on his desk. One day it was a stick figure with the word uncle under it. The next it was 3 figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. He didn't say a word about them, but he didn't throw them away either. Chidinma, still recovering, resumed light work duties and kept to herself, still unsure of where they stood. She would often pause at the door to thank Dyke before leaving her room, her humility woven into every movement. She didn't demand comfort. She didn't seek pity. But her silence screamed with gratitude and a lingering fear of being sent away again. Dyke began watching her in a way that confused him. It wasn't desire, it was admiration. He saw how she wiped the table even when no one was looking, how she paused mid-task to calm Adora when she whimpered, how she pushed through her asthma just to finish work others would consider beneath them. She wasn't just raising a child. She was doing it while carrying a storm inside her, and doing it with grace. He began making changes. First, he moved her to a better room in the East Wing, where sunlight filled the windows. Then he installed an air purifier without saying anything. One day, she walked in and found a brand new inhaler and medicine kit on her dresser. No note, no explanation, just care delivered in silence. She cried alone that night, not because she was weak, but because for the first time in years, someone had seen her, really seen her, and didn't want to take anything from her. It was during one of those quiet mornings that Chidinma finally spoke freely. Dyke had asked about her life, and something inside her told her to stop hiding. She told him everything, about her sister's death during childbirth, about how she had taken an Adora despite barely having food for herself, about her lost chance at university, and the constant fear of being fired or exposed. She confessed her asthma, her nights sleeping in open sheds, and how she'd begged a woman to let Adora sit in her shop during work hours. Dyke didn't interrupt. He sat still, his eyes locked on hers, each word cutting deeper than the last. When she finished, there was a silence between them that didn't feel heavy. It felt sacred. He looked at her then, not as a maid, not as a charity case, but as a woman who had fought life with nothing but faith and fists of dust. That day, something shifted permanently. Dyke Obi, the man who had once fired staff for leaving fingerprints on glass, decided to become someone who would never let her fight alone again. It was a slow process, this quiet undoing of grief. Dyke didn't declare his intentions. He didn't suddenly become cheerful or start hosting family dinners. But his actions spoke louder than any grand gesture. He began asking about Chidinma's education, then, without her knowledge, called the university she once attended to check her eligibility for readmission. When he informed her one morning that she had been accepted to continue her studies and that he had covered the fees in full, she burst into tears right there in the corridor. "Why would you do that for me?" she whispered, stunned. Dyke replied without emotion, "Because you deserve to have your life back." The mansion now carried a warmth it hadn't known in years. Adora started learning to read, Chidinma began attending weekend classes, and Dyke, he started coming home earlier. He stopped checking his work emails after 8 p.m. He began listening for the sounds of life instead of running from them. But just as life was finding rhythm again, the memory of that hospital night came rushing back to him. One evening, as he watched Chidinma from the corridor helping Adora brush her teeth, he remembered the exact shade of white his wife's hospital bedsheet had been. The image haunted him. The contrast between that night and this moment overwhelmed him. Later that night, he sat in the garden alone, remembering how helpless he had once been as doctors worked in vain to save his daughter. But this time, when he was given a second chance, he had acted. He had run. He had saved someone. The thought broke him. He covered his face and cried into his hands, not from sadness, but from a strange, sacred pain of healing. The past had left a scar, but for the first time, the future was whispering hope. He didn't know it yet, but the woman who once knelt to scrub his floors was slowly becoming the one he'd one day kneel before, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of love. Not yet. Not now. But the story was unfolding. And for the first time since the fire of loss had consumed him, Dyke Obi wasn't afraid of its flame. Because this time, the fire wasn't here to destroy. It was here to warm the parts of him he thought had died forever. Chidinma sat quietly in her new room, her hands folded on her lap as if waiting for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. The bed beneath her was soft, clean, far from the damp concrete floor she had known just weeks ago. There was a full-length mirror, a small closet, even a window with fresh curtains that let in light instead of choking her lungs with the thick air of a generator house. Yet she couldn't breathe easily, not out of sickness this time, but out of fear. It all felt temporary, too beautiful to last. She had learned long ago that kindness, especially from powerful people, came with an expiration date. She was used to being invisible, used to being unimportant. The thought that a man like Dyke Obi had gone out of his way, rushing her to the hospital, settling her bills, bringing her back, felt like an illusion her suffering mind had conjured. She had taught herself never to hope too hard. Hope had disappointed her too often. Adora, however, had no such fears. The child had taken to the mansion like a butterfly in spring. She ran through the hallways, careful but free, often leaving her crayon drawings on the dining table, singing to herself while brushing her teeth, humming softly as she arranged her teddy bears. She adored Dyke, often greeting him with wide eyes and a shy, "Good evening, Uncle," which he would answer with a tight nod and a soft smile that only the staff noticed. They watched it all with disbelief. The same man who once called laughter a distraction, now paused to tie the shoes of a little girl in the hallway. Whispers began to grow among the staff, some skeptical, others amazed. But no one dared ask questions. Chidinma noticed the change too, and it frightened her. She didn't know if she could trust this new version of him. She didn't know if his kindness was permanent or just a delayed reaction to guilt. And most of all, she didn't know what would happen if she allowed herself to feel safe, only for the ground to shift beneath her again. That night, as the house settled into its usual hush, Chidinma stepped outside and found Dyke standing by the garden railing. The moonlight painted silver lines across his face, but his expression was unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her, not with the gaze of a master to his maid, but with the eyes of a man seeing a woman who had survived things he could barely comprehend. "You don't owe me thanks," he finally said. "You should never have had to go through any of it in the first place." The words silenced her. They stood together, quiet, until Adora's soft voice echoed from inside, calling her mummy. Chidinma turned to go, but paused. "She's not really mine," she whispered. "She's my sister's child." Dyke turned then, eyebrows raised, but she had already walked back inside, leaving her truth behind like a delicate flower dropped at his feet. It was the first seed of trust, and he would never forget it. The revelation lingered in Dyke's mind for days. "She's not really mine." That sentence replayed over and over as he watched Chidinma move about the mansion with silent grace. It wasn't just the sacrifice that stunned him, it was the weight of it. She had carried another woman's child through suffering, illness, joblessness, and homelessness. She had never once called attention to it or begged for sympathy. She had done what most people with power and comfort could never do, loved someone completely, sacrificially, without recognition. And the way Adora looked at her, the way she clung to her in sleep, held her hand when walking, and mimicked her speech, it wasn't pretend. It was real. That child believed Chidinma was her mother. And in all the ways that mattered, she was. Dyke began to look at them differently, not with pity, but with awe. Something had softened inside him, a place he thought had died the day they buried his wife and daughter. And that softness wasn't weakness. It was warmth, healing, renewal. Chidinma, too, began to notice the small shifts in Dyke's behavior. He now waited for her to speak instead of brushing past her like an object. He began to notice when her breathing became strained and insisted she rest even when she protested. Once, she caught him reading Adora's drawing like it was a contract, eyes full of wonder. And perhaps the most surprising change, he laughed. It happened on a quiet afternoon when Adora, dressed in a makeshift superhero cape made of table napkins, ran into his office and declared, "Uncle, I'm saving this house from sadness." Dyke froze. For a second, his heart caught in his throat. Then he laughed, genuinely deeply. Chidinma had stood at the doorway, stunned, hand over her lips. The staff had stared like they'd witnessed a miracle. That sound had not existed in the mansion for half a decade. It was like the house itself breathed again. From that day, things began to blossom. Dyke called Chidinma into his study and told her he had applied for her university reinstatement. At first, she panicked, thinking it was a dismissal. But he assured her, "You can work part-time. Study fully. Whatever you need, you'll have it. You've given too much of your life away." The tears that rolled down her cheeks weren't loud or dramatic. They were the kind that soaked into the skin quietly, the kind you shed when someone finally sees the real you. Dyke handed her the acceptance letter, along with a schedule already drawn out to accommodate her classes. "This house can afford your dreams," he said. "You've earned them 100 times over." That night, Chidinma placed the letter under her pillow and held Adora a little tighter. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a sunrise. Weeks passed, and a new rhythm formed. Chidinma now split her time between the mansion and her classes at the university. She took public transportation each day despite Dyke offering a driver. "I need to feel I'm earning this," she explained, and he respected her choice. Her lecturers quickly took notice of her brilliance. She answered questions thoughtfully, turned in assignments early, and began mentoring younger students. Some found it odd that a woman her age had returned to school, but most admired her dedication. One professor pulled her aside after class and asked why she had been absent for so long. She smiled softly and replied, "Life needed me elsewhere." Meanwhile, Adora continued to grow under the quiet care of the mansion staff. She learned to read, paint, and play simple songs on a tiny plastic keyboard Dyke had purchased. The once silent halls now echoed gently with music, chalk laughter, and healing. The coldness that once froze the mansion was slowly melting with every passing day. One evening, after a long lecture and a longer commute, Chidinma arrived home late. She found Dyke asleep on the couch, a book open on his chest, Adora curled up beside him like a puppy. She stood silently, tears rising again, not because of sadness, but because this was everything she never thought she'd have. A home, a sense of belonging, safety. She tiptoed into the kitchen and reheated the soup she had prepared earlier, setting the table quietly. When Dyke stirred awake and joined her, she served him dinner, and they ate in silence, the kind that spoke more than words. After the meal, she found the courage to tell him more about her sister, about the abusive man who abandoned her during the pregnancy, and how she swore Adora would never feel unwanted. "She's not my blood," she said, voice trembling, "but she's all I have, and I'll fight for her until my last breath." Dyke listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he stood and walked around the table, stopping beside her. Then, in a moment that would replay in her memory forever, he reached out and touched her shoulder, not as a gesture of command, but comfort. "You didn't just save her," he said gently. "You saved me too." And in that simple moment, Chidinma felt something unfamiliar begin to blossom. Not hope, but love. A love not spoken yet, not rushed, but alive. It grew quietly in the spaces between them, in every shared smile, every thoughtful gesture, every silent dinner. The woman he once sent away was now the light that led him back from the darkness. And for the first time in years, Dyke Obi was no longer surviving. He was living. Dyke sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the paper drawing pinned next to his planner. It was one of Adaora's sketches, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, with crooked letters spelling, "Me, Mummy, Uncle." He had smiled when she handed it to him, calling him Uncle, with that same small voice that once shattered his heart. Now it softened it. Dyke had long since stopped trying to rationalize what he felt for Adora or for Chidinma. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't debt. It was connection. A second chance. Every day, he watched Chidinma grow in courage, juggling her university coursework with her job, never asking for anything more than she needed. He saw how she carried herself with quiet dignity, never stepping beyond her role, but never cowering beneath it either. She inspired him, not because she was perfect, but because she kept showing up even when life tried to silence her. And silently, Dyke began rooting for her, doing small things behind the scenes to make her journey a little lighter. He had her school fees paid months in advance, and spoke with the bursar to ensure she was not disturbed by any clerical issues. When she needed textbooks, they showed up at her doorstep, wrapped in brown paper, without a note. When she was too tired to cook, food arrived, always her favorite dishes. When she missed her morning bus, a black SUV would pull beside her with a familiar driver saying, "Olga said make I drop you." Chidinma always asked Dyke if he was behind it, but he would only shrug and say, "Maybe someone else is watching over you." But she knew. It wasn't just kindness, it was intention. And though he never crossed the line or made her feel obligated, the mansion was no longer just a place of work. It was a space where she and Adora felt seen, protected, even cherished. The staff noticed the change too. The once stone-faced CEO now greeted them with nods, gave early dismissals, and even asked after their children during breaks. The house that once echoed with emptiness was slowly filling with warmth, and at the center of it all was a woman he once tried to erase. One afternoon, Dyke stood by the window of his study, watching Chidinma in the garden as she helped Adora pick leaves for a class assignment. The child squealed with laughter as Chidinma held up a caterpillar on a stick, pretending it could talk. For a moment, Dyke felt something swell in his chest, an ache so tender it terrified him. Could he really let this happen again? Could he allow himself to love, to need, to hope? The last time he opened his heart, it had been ripped from him in a phone call that changed his life forever. But this time, it was different. This woman had already survived storms he could not imagine, and still she smiled. Still she laughed. And her laughter wasn't a threat to his silence. It was the cure. That evening, he asked Adora casually, "Do you think your mummy would want to go back to school full-time?" The girl grinned wide. "She wants to be a nurse. She wants to save people, just like you saved her." Dyke closed his eyes for a moment and whispered to himself, "Then we'll make sure she does." By the middle of a semester, Chidinma had become the shining star of her department. Her professors constantly praised her for her maturity, diligence, and brilliance. She spoke softly during lectures, always respectful, always prepared. Younger students looked up to her, often asking for help with assignments or advice on how to balance academics and life. Yet despite her growing popularity, she remained grounded, returning each evening to the mansion, tucking Adora in, and rising early to do what was needed. What no one knew was that most nights she studied with aching eyes and trembling hands, her inhaler always nearby. Sometimes she would fall asleep at her table, only to wake up at 4 a.m. to complete an assignment. Dyke saw it all. He said little but made sure she never lacked, stocking her room with vitamins, placing healthy snacks in her school bag when she wasn't looking, and one evening, surprising her with a brand new laptop, placed silently on her study desk with a note that read, "No one builds dreams with broken tools." Dyke had become a silent guardian, a man who no longer ran from the light Chidinma carried. He never said the word love, but it bloomed in how he showed up. It was in the way he cleared his schedule to attend one of her class presentations, sitting in the back of the hall like a stranger, only to leave a bouquet at her desk before she returned. It was in the way he asked Adora each day, "Did Mummy smile today?" and how the child would report, "Yes." And she ate all her lunch. The staff in the mansion now looked at Chidinma with admiration and curiosity. They whispered about the day she arrived and the fire she had walked through just to stand here, now not just as a maid, but as something more, something sacred. When her classmates once asked about her story, she simply said, "I'm here because someone believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself." And that was all she ever needed to say. But one evening, after a long lecture and an award for academic excellence, her professor mistakenly referred to Adora as your daughter. Chidinma paused for a heartbeat before replying, "She's not mine, but I would give my life for her." Dyke, who had attended the event quietly and heard those words from the hallway, felt something shift inside him. He had once thought strength was the absence of emotion, the ability to endure pain in silence. But now, watching this woman speak with quiet conviction, he understood that real strength was vulnerability wrapped in courage. After the ceremony, he walked her and Adora to the car. Chidinma looked up at him and said, "I never imagined a life like this." He smiled, gently touching Adora's head. "Neither did I." They rode home in silence, but it was the kind of silence that wrapped around them like a warm blanket, the kind that says we may not be a family by blood, but we are something even deeper than that. Something unspoken was blooming in the quiet spaces between them. Dyke began to notice it first in the way his heart skipped when Chidinma laughed too freely, or how his breath caught when she tied her scarf at the base of her neck. He began leaving his office door open, hoping to catch glimpses of her as she passed with Adora, holding her hand or carrying her books. He found himself asking her questions, not out of obligation, but curiosity. What was her favorite food? What did she dream of when she was a child? Had she ever been in love? And with every answer she gave, he found himself falling deeper into something he couldn't name. He didn't know when it started, but he realized one night, when she brought him a late dinner, placed it gently on the table, and said, "You work too much, sir," that he wished she'd just call him by his name. Not sir. Not Oga. Just Dyke. As if she saw the man beneath the title, the wounded one, the one still healing. Chidinma, on her part, felt the shift, but didn't trust it. Not fully. She had grown up learning that love came with conditions, and most times, with pain. But Dyke wasn't rushing her. He wasn't even courting her in the traditional sense. He was just there, showing up for her and Adora like a shadow that blocked out the worst of life's heat. He respected her space, listened without judgment, and offered his help without making her feel like a burden. Still, fear lingered. She often asked herself what would happen if he ever changed his mind. What if the world reminded him she was just a maid? What if someone from his board, or worse, the public, found out and made him choose between dignity and devotion? So she smiled and kept her heart guarded, even though it beat louder every time he looked at her for too long. And late at night, when Adora slept peacefully, Chidinma would sit by the window and wonder, could a woman like her ever truly belong in a man like that's life? Then came the moment that sealed something between them forever. Dyke had come home early, unusually so, and found Chidinma asleep at the study table, her school books open, her head resting on her arms. Adora had tucked a blanket around her, then fallen asleep on the floor beside her. Dyke didn't speak. He simply stood there, his heart full, the sight before him more beautiful than anything wealth could buy. He walked over, removed his coat, and draped it over Chidinma's shoulders. As he did, she stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a long second, they simply stared at each other. No words, just breath. Then she whispered, "Thank you." And he whispered back, "I should be the one thanking you." Neither moved. Neither dared say what was swelling between them. But in that silence, everything was said. A door had opened, not to the past, but to the future. The final semester arrived like a storm. With it came pressure, exhaustion, and an unexpected threat. Chidinma had just finished submitting her mid-semester project when Professor Dominic, a man infamous for his charm and cruelty, called her aside. She didn't think much of it at first. She had submitted early, and perhaps he wanted to commend her. But when she stepped into his office, the door shut quietly behind her, and the expression on his face turned from academic to something else, something dangerous. "Miss Chidinma," he said with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, "I've seen your record. You're brilliant, but I also know brilliance can be overrated in this system." She tilted her head, confused, cautious. He rose slowly, walked around the desk, and sat on its edge, too close. "I can make you top of this class, or I can make sure you don't graduate. What you choose to give me will determine what the school gives you in return." The room grew colder. Her heart pounded. Her asthma began to whisper its warning, but she said nothing. She simply gathered her things and walked out. That night, she said nothing to Dyke. She couldn't. Not yet. He had been so supportive, so kind. How could she bring this poison into the home he was building for her and Adora? She told herself it would pass. Maybe the man was bluffing. Maybe her grades would protect her. But the next class revealed the truth. Her coursework had suddenly been marked incomplete. Her project was returned without feedback. When she tried to raise the issue, Professor Dominic only smiled and said, "You'll learn, Miss Chidinma. You can either play the game or you can lose everything." The fear was real now. She had seen it happen to others, girls who dropped out, girls who couldn't fight back. And she had so much to lose. Adora, her job, the life she was just beginning to believe she deserved. So she stayed quiet, but the silence was breaking her. Each time she stepped onto campus, her heart clenched. Each night, she tried to hold herself together with prayer and suppressed tears. Adora noticed. Dyke noticed. But she kept saying, "I'm fine." Her asthma worsened under the pressure. Her medications began to run out faster. She missed meals. She cried in the shower. One day, Adora found her sitting on the floor of the kitchen, holding her inhaler with shaking hands. "Mummy, are we in trouble again?" the little girl asked. And that question, so soft, so heartbreaking, made her chest ache more than any threat ever could. Chidinma hugged the child tightly and whispered, "No, baby. Not again. Never again." But the truth was, she didn't know how much more she could endure. The thought of Dyke finding out terrified her, not because he would be angry with her, but because she feared he would see her as weak or broken. And most of all, she feared what he might do in his rage. So she wore a brave face, carried Adora to school, and walked into university each day like a soldier going to war. She thought she could bear it alone. But evil thrives in silence, and the silence was beginning to devour her. The week before final exams, Chidinma's world began to collapse. Professor Dominic escalated his threats. Her grades were frozen. She was removed from the list of eligible candidates for the graduating class. The news hit her like a truck. She had worked harder than anyone, had suffered more than most, and now, because of one man's sick hunger, everything was slipping away. She tried going to the department head, but the man was Dominic's friend. He waved her away with a warning. "You don't want to make enemies in your final weeks here, Miss Chidinma. Be smart." That night, she came home late, face pale, body trembling. She couldn't hide it anymore. Adora opened the door, and the child's eyes widened. "Mummy, your hands are shaking." Chidinma tried to lie. She tried to smile, but the tears came before the words could. She sank into the chair and wept, deep, helpless sobs that echoed through the walls. For the first time since she entered that mansion, she felt truly broken. It was Adora, once again, who did the unthinkable. While Chidinma lay curled in bed that night, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, the little girl took her small feet and tiptoed into Dyke's study. He looked up from his laptop, surprised. "Uncle," she said softly, "I think my mummy is sad like you used to be." He rose immediately, heart racing, and followed her. When he reached the hallway outside Chidinma's door, he paused, hearing the soft gasps of someone trying not to cry out loud. He knocked gently. Silence. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then he opened the door. Chidinma was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, her hair loose, her eyes red. She looked up, startled. "Sir, I'm sorry, But he crossed the room and knelt beside her. "No more pretending," he said firmly. "What is happening?" For a moment, she hesitated. Then, all at once, the dam broke. She told him everything, about the lecturer, the threats, the sabotage, the silence she'd been forced to carry. Dyke's face darkened. The rage that rose in him was silent, deadly, controlled. But beneath it was heartbreak. Heartbreak that this woman he admired had suffered so much without ever asking for help. "You should have told me," he whispered. "You never have to fight alone again." She looked down ashamed. "I didn't want you to see me as weak," she replied. "You've already done so much. I didn't want to be another burden." He lifted her chin gently. "You're not a burden. You're the only reason I remembered how to live." That night, Dyke didn't go to bed. He made calls to the board of the university, to a legal team, and to a handful of influential people whose voices made doors open or close forever. And as the city slept, the quiet war for Chidinma's future had already begun. She didn't know it yet, but the pain she had carried for weeks would finally meet its reckoning. And this time, she would not face it alone. The next morning began like any other, but the university gates were buzzing with murmurs by noon. A team of lawyers arrived on campus, accompanied by members of the university's External Oversight Committee. Dyke had filed a formal petition not only against Professor Dominic, but against the entire examination board, accusing them of corruption, sexual harassment, and institutional negligence. Documents, voice recordings, and testimonies, most provided anonymously by other victims who Dyke's legal team tracked down, were all submitted. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. By evening, Dominic's name was removed from the faculty portal. His office was sealed, and he was asked to appear before a disciplinary panel. The board moved quickly to restore Chidinma's records. Her projects were reviewed and confirmed as top of her class. When she received the news, she broke down in tears on the classroom steps, surrounded by classmates who had once only admired her from afar. Now, they applauded her, not just for surviving, but for standing. Dyke didn't show up to gloat or to receive credit. He watched from his car, parked at a distance, as Chidinma walked across the lawn, holding Adeora's hand, head held high for the first time in weeks. He didn't need praise. He didn't want applause. All he wanted was to see her win. That night, when she returned home and found him in the study, she didn't speak at first. She simply walked toward him and placed both hands on the table between them. "You fought for me," she whispered. "You didn't even think twice." Dyke looked up slowly. "You think I'd let anyone take away what you've built with your pain and your faith?" Chidinma's voice cracked. "I don't know what I've done to deserve all this." And he stepped around the table and took her hands in his. "You reminded me of what love looks like. Not the kind from fairy tales. The kind that survives storms." They stood there, eyes locked, and for the first time, nothing stood between them. No fear. No titles. No saidins. Later that evening, Dyke brought Adeora into the garden and handed her a tiny golden medal. "For being the bravest little girl," he said. She squealed with joy and hugged him tight. "Uncle, can I tell people you're my daddy now?" she asked innocently. Dyke smiled, his eyes glistening. "You can tell them whatever you like, Adeora." Chidinma watched from the doorway, her heart full, her fear dissolving. They weren't perfect. They weren't traditional. But they were real. They were whole. And in the quiet corner of the world they had built together, there was no longer just healing. There was love. Love that had once been broken by fire, but now rebuilt by the words that stopped it. The auditorium was filled to its brim with students, parents, lecturers, and dignitaries from across the state. The final year graduation ceremony of the university's Health Sciences Department had drawn a large crowd that year, but no one was more anticipated than one name on the list: Chidinma Uma. She had become something of a legend on campus, a woman who had once cleaned the lecture halls and now stood at the top of her class. Her story had spread like wildfire, not through media or social pity, but through whispered awe, the maid who rose through ashes. The day she stepped onto the podium in her white nurse's gown, there was a standing ovation. She held back tears as she accepted her certificate, gripping it not just as proof of education, but as a monument to survival. Adora, dressed in a small white dress of her own, clapped wildly from the front row, shouting, "That's my mummy." Dyke sat beside Adora, dressed in a simple but elegant agbada. No security detail, no corporate staff. Just a man proud beyond words. His eyes never left Chidinma from the moment she walked in. There was a peace about him that hadn't existed before, a stillness that came only from knowing you had done right by those who once had nothing. After the certificates were handed out and speeches concluded, Dyke quietly stepped away. But he didn't leave the building. Instead, he waited outside, by the garden courtyard beside the event hall, the place where new beginnings were often captured in photographs. When Chidinma came out surrounded by classmates and admirers, he signaled Adora to run to her. The child did so joyfully, pulling her towards him. "Uncle said he has something to tell you," she whispered in excitement. Chidinma followed, confused but smiling. When she reached him, Dyke didn't say a word immediately. He simply looked at her. This woman who once had nothing but a child and a duffel bag, who had knelt at his feet in fear, who had slept beside a generator just to survive. And now she stood before him, accomplished, radiant, and whole. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black box. Slowly, he dropped to one knee. The world around them seemed to pause. Students gasped. Phones came out. Chidinma's hands flew to her lips, trembling. And then, in the softest voice he had ever used, Dyke said, "You reminded me what it means to feel. You reminded me that love isn't loud, it's constant. You saved me from a fire I didn't know was still burning. Let me spend the rest of my life protecting your flame. Chidinma Uma, will you marry me?" She was already crying before he finished. And when she finally nodded, the entire courtyard erupted into applause. The mansion was no longer cold. Where there was once polished silence and untouched spaces, now lived laughter, soft music, and the gentle aroma of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. The wedding was held in a small, private garden ceremony weeks later, not the grand celebrity affair tabloids would have anticipated, but a ceremony filled with meaning. Adora walked down the aisle as the flower girl, her hair in beads, her face glowing. Chidinma wore an elegant ivory gown, nothing extravagant, just timeless and perfect. Dyke waited at the altar, tears in his eyes as she approached. When they exchanged vows, there was no rehearsed poetry, just truth. "You saved me," she said. "You gave me a name beyond the silence." And he replied, "You taught me to love without fear." The priest looked at both of them with pride as he said, "You may kiss your bride." And when Dyke kissed her, it wasn't just a union of love. It was a union of survival, of healing, of souls that had walked through fire and come out whole. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the mansion. The staff, who had once whispered in confusion, now danced in celebration. The garden lights twinkled. Adora danced barefoot under the moon, holding both their hands. At one point, Dyke lifted her into the air and spun her around, laughing freely, the kind of laughter that no longer echoed painfully but joyfully. Chidinma stood beside them, eyes full. She had once wondered if love was something people like her could ever deserve. Now, she wore it every day, wrapped around her like a shield. Dyke made sure she never lifted a single burden again. She didn't stop working, but now she worked as the head of a foundation dedicated to supporting women in education, using her story as a bridge to lift others. Adora started school at one of the best academies in Lagos. And their home, once frozen in time, now pulsed with joy, struggle, truth, and grace. On the anniversary of their wedding, Dyke took Chidinma and Adora to a quiet place by the beach. They sat on a blanket, watching the sunset, the waves brushing gently against the shore. Adora had fallen asleep in the crook of Dyke's arm. Chidinma lay with her head on his shoulder. "I used to be afraid of fire," he said softly, "but you taught me it can also warm." She reached for his hand and whispered, "Only if you stop running from it." And he smiled, kissing her temple. "I'm not running anymore." And so, the man who had once silenced laughter, who had once fired a maid because her child reminded him of grief, now lived with both of them at the center of his healing. Not because fate gave him a second chance, but because he chose not to let pain have the final word. And because one little girl once said, "She's the only mummy I have left," the fire that once destroyed had finally learned to love. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.